the vast and turbulent landscape of American history, few figures shine with the enduring intensity of Harriet Tubman. Born into the cruelty of slavery on Maryland's eastern shore, she began life as Araminta Ross, denied freedom, denied safety, denied even ownership of herself. Yet from those harsh marshlands emerged a woman whose courage would ripple across generations. Moses of the marshlands, the courage and crusade of Harriet Tubman traces her transformation from enslaved child to fearless liberator. After escaping bondage, Tubman could have remained safely in the North. Instead, she chose the unthinkable. She returned. Again and again, she ventured back into slave territory, guiding men, women, and children to freedom through the secret routes of the Underground Railroad. Each journey risked capture or death, yet her resolve never wavered. Her story did not end there. During the American Civil War, Tubman served as a nurse, scout, and spy for the Union Army. In the daring Combahee River raid, she became the first woman to lead an armed military expedition in the war, liberating hundreds in a single, decisive strike. This book moves beyond legend to reveal the woman beneath the myth, one who endured physical suffering, financial hardship, and relentless prejudice, yet remained anchored in faith and justice. It is a portrait of resilience, moral clarity, and unwavering action. Harriet Tubman did more than escape slavery. She dismantled its power one journey at a time. Chapter 1. Born into Bondage. Childhood on a Maryland plantation. The landscape of Dorchester County, Maryland, in the early 1820s was a study in deceptive tranquility. The Choptank River wound its way through lush marshes and flat, fertile fields, reflecting the expansive sky in its brackish waters. To the casual observer, the eastern shore was a pastoral idyll of tidewater agriculture. Yet, beneath this veneer of natural beauty lay the grotesque machinery of human bondage. It was here, amidst the humid air and the droning of cicadas, that Araminta Ross, known to her family as Minty, drew her first breath. She was born the property of Edward Broders, a fact that defined the parameters of her existence before she could even comprehend her own name. Minty's world was circumscribed by the plantation's geography and the rigid hierarchy of the slave system. Her earliest memories were not of play or leisure, but of the pervasive anxiety that permeated the slave quarters. The cabins were rough-hewn structures, drafty in the winter and stifling in the summer, with dirt floors that turned to mud when the rains came. Despite the squalor, these spaces were sanctuaries of a sort, where families huddled together against the darkness, whispering stories and prayers, knowing that at any moment the whim of a master could shatter their fragile unity. The fear of the auction block was a tangible presence, a cold wind that blew through the cracks in the walls. From a tender age, Minty was thrust into the brutality of labor. The innocence of childhood was a luxury afforded only to the white children. In the big house, by the time she was 5 or 6 years old, she was hired out to neighbors, a common practice that generated income for the owner but exposed the enslaved child to new depths of cruelty. One of her first assignments was as a nursemaid for a woman named Miss Susan. Minty was tasked with watching over a sleeping baby at night, forbidden to let the child cry. Whenever the infant whimpered, Miss Susan would reach for a whip that hung near her bed. The scars on Minty's neck and back, earned before she had even shed her milk teeth, became a permanent topography of her suffering, a map of pain she would carry for the rest of her life. Her transition to field work exposed her to the raw elements and the physical exhaustion that characterized plantation life. She hauled logs, plowed fields, and checked muskrat traps in the freezing marshes. The work was grueling, designed to break the body and the spirit. Minty, however, possessed an iron constitution. Though small in stature, she developed a muscular strength that rivaled the strongest men on the plantation. She learned the rhythms of the land, the tides of the river, the calls of the birds, the density of the woods. This intimate knowledge of the natural world, forged in the crucible of forced labor, would later become the arsenal of her liberation. Yet, the psychological toll was as heavy as the timber she hauled. She witnessed the arbitrary violence inflicted upon her people, the whippings, the separations, the systematic dehumanization. She saw her mother, Rit, struggle to keep the family fed and clothed, her love a fierce shield against a world intent on destroying them. She watched her father, Ben Ross, navigate his role as a timber inspector with dignity, earning a reputation for honesty and skill even within the confines of slavery. These parental figures provided a moral foundation, teaching her that while her body might be owned by another, her soul belonged to God alone. Life on the Maryland plantation was a paradox of devastating hardship and profound resilience. In the slave quarters, amidst the sorrow songs and the hushed conversations, a culture of resistance was quietly brewing. Minty absorbed the stories of the Bible, particularly the saga of the Israelites in Egypt. The narrative of deliverance, of a God who heard the cries of the oppressed, resonated deeply within her young heart. The marshes and fields were her Egypt. The Brodus farm was her house of bondage. As she grew from a battered child into a strong young woman, the landscape that held her captive began to transform in her mind. It was no longer just a prison. It was a puzzle to be solved, a wilderness to be traversed. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the furrowed rows of the tobacco fields, watered by tears and sweat, waiting for the season of harvest. Chapter 2: Early Trials, Hardship, Injury, and Faith. As Araminta Ross transitioned from childhood into adolescence, the harsh realities of her enslavement intensified, yet her spirit began to crystallize into something formidable. The 1830s brought with them a defining moment of trauma that would paradoxically catalyze her spiritual awakening. It was an incident of senseless violence, typical of the era yet extraordinary in its consequences, that altered the trajectory of her life and her very consciousness. The event occurred at a dry goods store in the nearby crossroads. Minty, then a teenager, had been sent on an errand when she encountered an overseer pursuing a runaway slave. The atmosphere in the store was thick with tension. The fugitive, terrified and desperate, was cornered. The overseer, in a rage, demanded that Minty help restrain the man. In an act of spontaneous defiance that presaged her future career, she refused to intervene, allowing the man a moment to bolt for the door. Fury etched across his face. The overseer snatched a 2-pound iron weight from the counter and hurled it with lethal intent at the fleeing man. He missed his target. The heavy iron struck Minty squarely in the forehead, crushing her skull and driving pieces of her shawl into her brain. She collapsed into darkness. For weeks, she lay in a coma on a pallet in her mother's cabin, hovering between life and death. Her mother, Rit, nursed her with a desperate tenderness, applying poultices and praying over her broken child. When Minty finally awoke, she was changed. The physical recovery was slow and agonizing. The injury left her with permanent temporal lobe epilepsy. For the rest of her life, she would suffer from sudden, uncontrollable seizure spells of narcolepsy where she would drop into a deep sleep. In the middle of a conversation or labor to the slaveholders, this disability rendered her damaged goods, diminishing her market value. Edward Brodus attempted to sell her, but no buyer wanted a slave who might fall asleep in the fields. However, within the quiet sanctuary of her own mind, the injury opened a door to the divine. During her seizures and sleeping spells, Minty began to experience vivid, lucid dreams and auditory hallucinations. She heard music that seemed to descend from the heavens. She saw visions of angels and landscapes bathed in unearthly light. While modern medicine might classify these as symptoms of brain trauma, for Minty, they were direct communications from God. This spiritual evolution transformed her perception of the world. The pain and hardship were no longer senseless suffering, they were a refining fire. Her faith, previously a source of comfort, became a roaring furnace of conviction. She began to converse with God, as one would with a familiar friend, asking for guidance, protection, and justice. She prayed for her master, initially asking for his conversion, but as his cruelty persisted, her prayers turned darker, asking for his removal if he would not change. When Brodus died shortly thereafter, a profound sense of guilt and terrified, or at the power of her own intercession washed over her. Despite her injury, Minty returned to work, her physical strength undiminished. She was hired out to a man named John Stewart, a builder who recognized her capacity for heavy labor. Under Stewart, she worked alongside her father, Ben, in the timber yards. This period was crucial for her development, working in the forests, away from the constant scrutiny of the plantation house. She learned the skills of a woodsman. She mastered the use of an axe, learned to identify trees by their bark and leaves, and understood the subtle signs of the forest floor. She absorbed the geography of the waterways and the hidden paths used by the timber crews. It was also during this time, around 1844, that she married a free black man named John Tubman. The union was complex. She remained enslaved while he was free, meaning any children she bore would inherit her status, not his. She took his last name and, around the time of her marriage, adopted her mother's name, Harriet. This shedding of Minty and the assumption of Harriet Tubman marked a psychological transition. She was no longer the child nursemaid or the battered girl in the store. She was a woman of faith and fire, forging an identity independent of her owner's ledger. However, the marriage brought its own trials. John Tubman did not share her burning desire for freedom. He was content with his status and fearful of the risks associated with escape. When Harriet spoke of running away, he threatened to betray her to her master. This betrayal by her husband was a bitter pill, revealing that the chains of slavery could also bind the hearts of free men. It underscored the solitary nature of her calling. Her visions continued, urging her northward, whispering of a land where the yoke would be broken. The injury had broken her skull, but it had liberated her spirit, creating a direct line to a higher power that would guide her through the perilous years to come. Chapter 3, Escaping Chains, First Steps to Freedom. The year was 1849. The air on the eastern shore was thick with rumors of sale and separation. Following the death of Edward Broders, the financial instability of his estate loomed like a thunderhead over the enslaved community. For Harriet Tubman, the threat was no longer abstract, it was imminent. She learned that she and her brothers were to be sold to a chain gang destined for the Deep South, a fate often considered worse than death. A one-way ticket to the brutal sugar and cotton fields where life expectancy was measured in scant years. The realization crystallized in her mind with terrifying clarity: liberty or death. There could be no middle ground. The decision to escape was a rending of the soul. It meant leaving behind everything she had ever known: her parents, her siblings, her community, and her husband, John, who refused to join her. To flee was to step into a void, to become a fugitive hunted by the law and by men who saw her only as lost capital. Yet, the voice of God, which she heard so clearly in her visions, urged her forward. "I reasoned this out in my mind," she would later say. "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." Her initial attempt was made with her brothers, Ben and Henry. Fear, however, is a potent contagion. As they moved into the unknown, the brothers faltered. The unfamiliar shadows of the woods and the staggering penalty of capture broke their resolve. They turned back, dragging Harriet with them. The failure was bitter, but it served to sharpen her determination. She realized that her journey, at least the first leg of it, would have to be solitary. She could not carry the fear of others. Her own burden was heavy enough. A few weeks later, Harriet set out alone. She could offer no formal goodbyes to her mother or father, for fear of implicating them or weakening her own resolve. Instead, she sang a coded song near the slave quarters, a spiritual about bidding farewell to friends, hoping her loved ones would understand the hidden message carried on the melody. With nothing but the clothes on her back and a small supply of food, she slipped into the night. The North Star, fixed and unmoving in the celestial sphere, became her silent guide. The journey was a harrowing gauntlet of physical and psychological endurance. She traveled by night, navigating the dense forests and marshes she had learned to read during her years as a timber worker. Every snapping twig sounded like a pistol shot. Every shadow resembled a slave catcher. She relied on the network of The Underground Railroad, a clandestine web of Quaker sympathizers, free blacks, and abolitionists. Her first contact was a white woman in the neighborhood who had previously whispered an offer of help. This woman directed her to the next safe house. Initiating Harriet into the secret geography of freedom, she slept in potato holes, barns, and untamed thickets. She moved with the stealth of a fox, utilizing the skills honed in the Maryland timber yards. The Choptank River, once a boundary of her enslavement, became a barrier she had to cross. She waded through icy streams, shivering in the autumn chill, her epileptic seizures a constant, terrifying liability if a spell struck while she was in the open or while crossing a river. It would be the end. Yet, she felt a divine presence shielding her, a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Crossing the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania was a moment of transcendent euphoria. The landscape itself seemed to change. I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person, she later recalled. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. The air tasted different. It was the air of a free state. The chains that had bound her since birth, legal, physical, and mental, had been shattered. However, the joy of liberation was quickly tempered by a profound loneliness. She was a stranger in a strange land. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom, she lamented. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home after all was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. In Philadelphia, she found work and connected with the abolitionist community, including William Still, the tenacious conductor of the Underground Railroad. But the city's cobblestones offered no comfort while her family remained in the mud of the Eastern Shore. The freedom she had won felt incomplete, a solitary feast while her kin starved. It was in this crucible of loneliness and loyalty that Harriet Tubman transformed from a fugitive into a liberator. She resolved that she would not simply enjoy her freedom, she would weaponize it. She would return to the belly of the beast. Chapter 4. Return to Rescue. The Underground Railroad begins. Philadelphia in the early 1850s was a bustling metropolis of commerce and contradiction, a haven for free blacks, yet shadowed by the looming reach of Southern slave laws. For Harriet, now working as a domestic and a cook in hotels and clubhouses, the city was merely a staging ground. Every dollar she earned was not for her own comfort, but for the financing of an audacious mission, the liberation of her family, the realization that she could not be fully free while her loved ones remained in chains gnawed at her. The Moses of her people was being born not in the wilderness, but in the crowded, sooty streets of a free city. Her first opportunity to return arose in December 1850. Word reached Philadelphia through the clandestine channels of the Underground Railroad that her niece, Keziah, and Keziah's two children were to be sold at an auction in Cambridge, Maryland. The urgency was absolute. Harriet did not hesitate. Despite the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a draconian law that compelled citizens of free states to assist in the capture of runaways and denied fugitives the right to a jury trial, she turned her face south. The danger was now exponential. She was a fugitive herself, and returning to Maryland was tantamount to walking into a trap. Harriet traveled to Baltimore, where she hid with her brother-in-law, Tom Tubman. The plan they devised was brazen. On the day of the auction, Keziah's husband, a free black man named John Bowley, bid for his wife and children. He won the bid but, naturally, had no money to pay. While the auctioneer adjourned for lunch, Bowley spirited Keziah and the children to a nearby safe house near the waterfront. Under the cover of darkness, Harriet orchestrated their movement to a small boat, ferrying them up the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore and from there, onward to Philadelphia. This first rescue was a tactical masterpiece of timing and nerve. It proved to Harriet that the impossible was achievable. She had breached the fortress of slavery and extracted 3 souls. The success intoxicated her, not with pride, but with possibility. If she could save Keziah, she could save her brothers. she could save them all. In the spring of 1851, she returned. This time, she aimed to retrieve her brother Moses. She navigated the familiar woods, relying on the moss on the trees and the position of the stars. She did not approach the plantation house but sent word through the grapevine, a complex system of whispered messages, passed from slave to slave. She waited in the woods, mimicking the hoot of an owl, a signal her brothers knew well. Moses and 2 other men answered the call. Leading them required immense discipline. She had to keep them quiet, calm, and moving swiftly through the terrain. She knew better than the men who hunted her. Later that year, she made a particularly painful journey. Her heart still held a space for her husband, John Tubman. She returned to Dorchester County with a new suit of clothes for him, hoping to persuade him to join her in the north. She made her way to his cabin, her heart pounding with anticipation. What she found devastated her. John had remarried. He had taken another wife, a free woman, and was living comfortably. When Harriet sent word to him, he refused to see her. He was happy where he was, he said. The rejection was a severing of the final emotional tether to her past life as a submissive wife. She had risked the gallows for love, only to find that love had been replaced. Standing in the darkness outside, the place that was once her home, Harriet made a choice. She would not waste her grief. If she could not save her husband, she would save others who yearned for freedom. She gathered a group of fugitives who were desperate to leave and led them north. The heartbreak hardened her resolve. She was now married only to the cause. These early expeditions marked the formal beginning of her career as a conductor. She began to systematize her methods. She learned which houses were safe and which were traps. She memorized the schedules of patrols. She understood that winter was the best time for escape. As the nights were long and people stayed indoors, she learned to carry a pistol, not just for protection against slave catchers, but to ensure discipline among her charges. "You'll be free or die," she would tell faltering runaways, knowing that a returned slave would be tortured into revealing the secrets of the railroad. Harriet was no longer just running. She was attacking the institution of slavery with surgical precision. Each return trip was an act of war, a theft of valuable property that infuriated the slaveholders of the Eastern Shore. They could not understand how their slaves were vanishing into thin air. They began to whisper of a man, a Moses, who was stealing their wealth. They never suspected that the mastermind was a 5-foot-tall woman with a deep scar on her forehead, moving like a ghost through the marshes she once plowed. Chapter 5: Codes, Signals, and Secrecy, Mastering the Escape Network. The Underground Railroad was not a literal railway of steel and steam, but a fragile, shifting tapestry of human trust, woven together by secrecy and desperation. For Harriet Tubman, mastering this network was not merely a matter of logistics, it was a matter of survival. As her reputation grew and the price on her head escalated, she could not afford a single misstep. Success depended on a sophisticated language of deception codes, signals, and disguises that rendered her and her charges invisible in plain sight. Harriet operated in a world where literacy was forbidden to her people, so she utilized the oral and auditory traditions of African American culture as tools of espionage. Spirituals became her primary method of coded communication. A song was never just a song. "Steal Away to Jesus" was not merely a hymn of piety. It was a directive to prepare for imminent departure. "Wade in the water" was an instruction to leave the trail and enter the river to throw bloodhounds off the scent. Before approaching a plantation, she would often sing "Go Down Moses" from the edge of the woods. If the response from the fields was a specific verse or silence, she knew it was safe to proceed. If the tempo changed or a warning verse was sung, she melted back into the shadows. Her mastery of mimicry was uncanny. In the deep woods, the hoot of an owl or the call of a whippoorwill were common night sounds. Harriet perfected these calls, using them to signal her location to fugitives hiding in the brush without alerting nearby overseers. A specific sequence of hoots indicated all clear, while another warned of danger. These natural sounds bypassed the suspicion of white patrols who heard only the noises of the forest, unaware that a tactical operation was unfolding beneath their noses. The stations of the railroad, the safe houses, were marked by subtle signs. A lantern placed in a specific window, a quilt with a wagon wheel pattern hung on a clothesline, or a certain arrangement of bricks on a walkway signaled safety. Harriet memorized these changing details across hundreds of miles. She worked closely with station masters like Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, Delaware, a Quaker shoemaker who provided shoes, shelter, and money to thousands of runaways. Garrett and Tubman developed a deep bond of mutual respect, their operation relying on precise timing. Harriet would often arrive with her passengers in the dead of night, leaving before dawn to avoid detection. Disguise was another weapon in her arsenal. Harriet knew that a young, strong woman traveling alone or with a group was suspicious. Therefore, she often transformed herself. On one occasion, spotting a former master approaching her on the road, she quickly bought a pair of live chickens. She bent her small frame over, hobbling like an elderly woman, and then deliberately released the chickens as she scrambled to catch the squawking birds, creating a scene of chaotic comedy. The master rode past, laughing at the old fool, never realizing he had just brushed shoulders with the most wanted woman in Maryland. She, sometimes dressed as a man or carried a book, pretending to read it, a brilliant ruse. As everyone knew slaves were illiterate, the logistics of the journey required rigorous planning. Harriet preferred to leave on Saturday nights. This was a strategic choice. Sunday was a day of rest, and the printing presses for newspapers were closed. Notices for runaway slaves could not be published until Monday morning, giving her a crucial head start of nearly 36 hours before the alarm could be widely spread. She carried paregoric, an opiate-based medicine, to silence crying babies instantly, ensuring that an infant's wail wouldn't betray the group. Perhaps the most critical element of her network was the strict discipline she enforced. The Underground Railroad was not a democracy. Once a fugitive joined Harriet's party, her word was law. She carried a pistol, a revolver that served a dual purpose. It was protection against slave catchers, certainly, but it was also the ultimate enforcer of resolve. If a runaway, exhausted and terrified, decided to turn back, they became a liability to the entire network. A returned slave would be tortured until they gave up the locations of safe houses and the identity of the conductor. Harriet was known to aim her weapon at faltering men and women, delivering the chilling ultimatum, "Go on or die." She never had to pull the trigger, but the steel in her voice made it clear that she would sacrifice one to save the many. This chapter of her life reveals Harriet Tubman not as a passive figure of folklore, but as a brilliant tactician of guerrilla warfare. She subverted the very tools of oppression, ignorance, stereotypes, and fear, turning them against the oppressors. The swamps became her fortress, the night her ally, and the songs of the plantation her encrypted telegrams. She built a corridor of freedom through the heart of slave country, paved with silence and illuminated by the invisible fire of her genius. Chapter 6: Courage in Darkness, Leading Others North. The journey from the slave-holding South to the free North was a physical odyssey of hundreds of miles, traversing a landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and lethal. For Harriet Tubman, leading others through this terrain required a courage that transcended mere bravery. It required a profound capacity to endure suffering and to inspire that endurance in others. The darkness of the night was their cloak, but it was also a realm of terror for those unaccustomed to the wild. Harriet's role was to be the light within that darkness, the steady hand that pulled her people through the mire. The physical demands of these treks were staggering. Harriet and her charges walked for weeks, often in the bitter cold of late autumn or winter. They waded through freezing rivers to hide their scent from the relentless bloodhounds. Their clothes froze to their skin. Their feet, often wrapped in rags or ill-fitting shoes, bled onto the snow. Food was scarce. They survived on what they could carry: parched corn, hardtack, or what they could forage. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache in the belly that sharpened the senses but weakened the limbs. Harriet's own physical condition made these feats even more miraculous. The brain injury she sustained in her youth meant that the threat of a seizure was always present. There were moments deep in the woods when she would suddenly collapse into a trance-like sleep. Her passengers, terrified and leaderless, would have to wait in silence, watching over her prone form, praying she would wake before the slave catchers arrived. When she did awake, she would often rise with renewed clarity, claiming that God had shown her the path forward in her dreams, whether divine intervention or the firing of damaged neurons. Her instincts following these episodes were unerring. She would abruptly change direction, leading the group away from an ambush or toward a hidden boat, baffling her followers until the danger they had narrowly avoided became clear. One particularly harrowing journey involved a group of 11 fugitives, including one of her brothers. It was late in the year, and the weather was merciless. They reached a scheduled safe house, tired and starving, only to find the station master gone or too fearful to open the door. The group was exposed, disheartened, and on the verge of panic. Harriet, sensing the collapse of morale, led them into the damp woods. She built a fire a dangerous risk to warn them and went off alone to find help. She returned hours later, not with a wagon, but with the sheer force of her will, urging them onward to another location miles away. She practically carried the weakest among them, her small frame a reservoir of inexhaustible strength. The psychological burden of leadership was immense. Harriet had to manage the varying temperaments of her charges. Some were paralyzed by fear. Others were reckless with hope. She had to be a mother, a commander, a nurse, and a priestess. She told stories to keep their spirits up, whispered assurances of the freedom that awaited them, and when necessary, used the cold steel of her revolver to quell dissent. She absorbed their terror so they wouldn't have to carry it all. The route north was not a straight line. It was a zigzagging, backtracking maze designed to confuse pursuers. They crossed the Appalachians, navigating steep, rocky trails in pitch blackness. They hid in the false bottoms of wagons, covered in sacks of grain or piles of manure, barely breathing as they passed through toll booths and checkpoints. They crossed the suspension bridge at Niagara Falls, the roar of the water drowning out the pounding of their hearts. Arriving in St. Catharines, Canada, the final destination for many after the Fugitive Slave Act made the northern U.S. unsafe, was the culmination of this agonizing trek. Canada was the promised land, the only place where the long arm of American law could not reach. Watching her charges touch Canadian soil, Harriet witnessed the transformation from chattel to human. She saw men fall to their knees and kiss the ground. She heard women weep with a joy that was almost painful to behold. For Harriet, however, the arrival was never the end. It was merely a pause, as she watched the people she had saved begin their new lives, finding work, building homes. Learning to read her mind would drift back to the Maryland marshes. She would think of her parents, old and frail, still waiting. She would think of the millions still in bondage. The comfort of Canada could not seduce her into complacency. The darkness of the South still called to her, and she knew she had to answer. Her courage was not a finite resource that could be depleted. It was a renewable energy, fueled by the injustice she left behind. She would rest, she would pray, and then, inevitably, she would turn back toward the dark. Chapter 7: Facing Danger, Slave Catchers, and Betrayal. The passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 transformed the entire United States into a hostile territory for runaways. It was no longer enough to reach Pennsylvania or New York. The tentacles of the slave power reached into every free state, deputizing ordinary citizens as slave catchers and offering bounties that turned human hunting into a lucrative industry. For Harriet Tubman, this meant that every mission was played out against a backdrop of heightened, lethal stakes. She was not just evading angry farmers, she was outwitting professional trackers, bounty hunters, and a federal government weaponized. Against her people, the landscape was infested with spies. A safe house could turn dangerous overnight if a sympathizer was bribed or threatened. Betrayal was a currency as common as gold. Harriet navigated this treachery with a paranoia that was entirely justified. She learned to trust no one fully, save for a select inner circle. She developed a sixth sense for deception. There were instances where she would approach a known safe house, stop suddenly, and refuse to enter sensing something wrong in the atmosphere and lack of a usual signal. A strange horse tied nearby, and she would divert her group into the cold woods, later learning that marshals had been waiting inside. The bounty on Harriet's head became the stuff of legend, while the often cited figure of $40, zero is likely an exaggeration by later biographers. The combined rewards offered by various slaveholders for her capture were substantial, amounting to thousands of dollars of fortune in that era. Posters describing Moses began to appear, though they often misidentified her as a man or gave vague descriptions. This ambiguity was her shield. The slave catchers were looking for a formidable male leader, not a short, missing-toothed woman, dressed like a field hand or a feeble grandmother. One of the most dangerous episodes occurred in Wilmington, Delaware. Harriet was waiting for a group of fugitives when she found herself surrounded by bounty hunters, who were meticulously checking the papers of every black person in the area. Trapped in a friend's house, escape seemed impossible. Harriet, utilizing her genius for disguise, had her host send a message to a nearby stable. She then stepped out of the house pretending to be a boisterous, scolding servant, chasing some escaping chickens or shouting at a non-existent child. The sheer audacity of the noise and the mundane nature of the act made her invisible to men looking for a secretive fugitive. She walked right past them. Another close call happened on a train. Harriet was traveling south, heading into the danger zone, when she saw a white man reading a newspaper that had a runaway notice for her. He looked up, his eyes scanning the car. Harriet, thinking quickly, grabbed a newspaper from a nearby seat and held it up, pretending to read it intently. The man glanced at her and moved on. He assumed that because she was reading, she could not be the illiterate slave described in the paper. He didn't notice that in her haste, she was holding the newspaper upside down. The threat of betrayal came not just from whites, but sometimes from within the black community, individuals broken by torture or seduced by the promise of reward. Money. Harriet was acutely aware of this. She kept her plans compartmentalized. No one knew the full route but her. She changed her methods constantly, never using the same path twice in succession. The most personal danger involved the rescue of her elderly parents, Ben and Rit, in 1857. They were too old to walk the hundreds of miles to freedom. Their capture would not only mean a return to slavery, but likely death. The logistics were a nightmare. Harriet had to procure a wagon and a horse, a risky acquisition for a fugitive. She cobbled together a makeshift harness from straw and rope. She drove them boldly through the streets, relying on the cover of night and the incredulity of observers who couldn't imagine a fugitive would be so conspicuous. It was a race against time and fragility. At one point, her father, Ben, refused to look at her face during the journey, keeping his eyes covered so that if he were captured and questioned, he could truthfully swear he had not seen his daughter. Every shadow held a potential captor. Every snapping twig was a potential ambush. Yet, Harriet moved with a terrifying calm. She looked danger in the eye and forced it to blink. She was fighting a system designed to crush her, and she was winning. The slave catchers had the law, the guns and the dogs. Harriet had the night, the woods, and an unshakable belief that God was a co-conspirator. In this high-stakes game of cat and mouse, the mouse was rewriting the rules of the hunt. Chapter 8, Faith as Compass, Spiritual Strength in Action. To analyze the life of Harriet Tubman without centering her faith is to describe a lamp, without mentioning the oil. Her spirituality was not a Sunday ritual, it was the engine of her survival, the map of her journeys and the source of her tactical genius. In the historiography of American heroes, her visions are often treated as eccentricities or symptoms of her brain injury. However, for Harriet and for the people she led, her relationship with the divine was the absolute reality upon which their liberation depended. Harriet dwelt in a world where the veil between the physical and the spiritual was gossamer thin. She did not merely believe in God, she conversed with him. She referred to the divine presence not as a distant monarch, but as a constant travel companion. "I wasn't afraid of the man," she once said of a slave catcher, "because I had the Lord with me." This was not a metaphor, She felt a protective presence that she claimed rendered her invisible to her enemies, and invincible in her purpose. Her narcoleptic episodes, born of the iron weight that crushed her skull, became portals to revelation. In these trance states, she claimed to fly over fields and towns, seeing rivers and mountains she had never physically visited. She described seeing lines of demarcation, safe paths versus traps, illuminated in her mind's eye on numerous occasions. These visions dictated her movements on the Underground Railroad. She would halt a group at a fork in the road, fall into a deep sleep, and awake, insisting they take the path that seemed less logical. Time and again, it was later discovered that bounty hunters had staked out the logical path to her followers. She was a prophetess. Heaven sanctioned her word. Her faith was robustly Old Testament in its favor. She saw herself as a participant in a biblical narrative. The slaveholders were Pharaoh. The Ohio River was the Jordan. Canada was Canaan. She appropriated the imagery of Exodus not just as comfort, but as a political strategy. When she sang, "Go down, Moses," she was summoning the wrath of God against the institution of slavery. Her God was a God of justice, a warrior who took sides. She did not pray for peace. She prayed for liberation. This spiritual fortitude provided the psychological armor necessary to withstand the crushing stress of her life, the isolation of the woods, the constant threat of torture and death, the responsibility for the lives of others. These pressures would have broken a secular mind. Harriet, however, offloaded this burden onto the divine. She operated with a holy boldness. When money ran out, she sat down on the sidewalk and prayed for it, fully expecting it to arrive, and often, through the kindness of strangers or the sudden appearance of an abolitionist friend, it did. Her faith also informed a deep humility. Despite being celebrated by the leading intellectuals of the day, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Frederick Douglass, and Franklin Sanborn, she never viewed herself as the architect of her success. "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger," she famously said, but she always appended that it was the Lord who steered the wheel. This humility made her an effective leader. She was a vessel, not a monarch. It allowed her to move among the elite of Boston and the enslaved of Maryland with equal grace. In the later years of the Civil War, when she served as a scout, spy, and nurse for the Union Army, this faith continued to guide her. She walked through smallpox wards without fear of infection, believing she was protected until her work was done. She led the Combahee River raid, standing at the bow of a gunboat, singing out to the enslaved people on the banks, looking like a black-clad angel of judgment. Harriet Tubman's life is a testament to the power of spiritual conviction translated into action. Her faith was not a sedative, it was a stimulant. It did not encourage her to wait for heaven. It compelled her to bring heaven to earth by shattering the hell of slavery. Her compass was internal, calibrated to a north star that was both a celestial body and a divine promise. In the end, her greatest miracle was not just that she survived, but that she remained whole, a woman who walked through fire and did not smell of smoke, because she believed she was walking hand in hand with God. Chapter 9: Family and Freedom, Rescuing Loved Ones. The psychological landscape of slavery was designed to obliterate the concept of family. The institution thrived on the atomization of the individual, stripping away lineage, marriage, and parental bonds to ensure that loyalty belonged solely to the master. Yet, in the heart of Harriet Tubman, the flame of familial devotion burned with an intensity that no overseer could extinguish. Her escape to Philadelphia in 1849 was a monumental personal victory, a veritable resurrection from the social death of enslavement. As she crossed the line into the free state of Pennsylvania, she famously remarked that she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person. There was a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields. However, this transformative joy was almost immediately tempered by a profound, aching loneliness. The freedom she had seized was solitary, and for a woman whose identity was deeply rooted in her kinship network, solitary freedom was a hollow prize. It was this unbearable separation that catalyzed her transformation from a fugitive into a liberator. The decision to return to Maryland was not made lightly. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had cast a dark pall over the northern states, essentially turning the entire country into a hunting ground for slave catchers returning to the site of her. Enslavement was tantamount to suicide. Capture meant to return to the lash, sail to the deep south, or death. Yet, the specter of her family's suffering outweighed the terror of her own potential demise. Her first mission was not a grand sweep of strangers, but a targeted intimate rescue. In December 1850, news reached her that her niece, Keziah, and Keziah's two children were to be sold at an auction in Cambridge. The horror of the auction block, the permanent fracturing of families, was the ultimate nightmare for the enslaved. Tubman's response was immediate. She traveled back into the lion's den, orchestrating a daring rescue involving Keziah's husband, John Bowley. That spirited the family away from the very steps of the courthouse to the safety of Baltimore, and eventually Philadelphia. This initial success laid the foundation for a pattern of behavior that would define the next decade of her life. Tubman did not view freedom as an abstract political concept, but as a tangible reality that her brothers, sisters, and parents deserved to experience. In 1851, she returned for her brother Moses. In 1854, she executed a particularly complex rescue of 3 of her brothers, Ben, Henry, and Robert, along with several others. This mission required meticulous planning and a deep understanding of the psychological state of those she was rescuing. She knew that fear could paralyze, that the unknown terrors of the journey could seem more daunting than the familiar miseries of the plantation. Tubman had to be not just a guide, but a spiritual anchor, infusing her kin with the courage to step into the void. She used spirituals as coded messages, their mournful melodies carrying instructions on when it was safe to move and when to stay hidden, turning the culture of the enslaved into a weapon against their oppressors. The most poignant of her rescue missions, perhaps, was the retrieval of her aging parents, Ben and Rit. By 1857, her father was in grave danger due to his involvement in hiding other runaways. They were old, frail, and unable to walk the long, arduous miles that younger refugees trekked. The logistics of moving to elderly people through hostile territory were staggering. Tubman, displaying characteristic ingenuity, constructed a makeshift wagon and acquired a horse, risking exposure on open roads to transport them. This act was the culmination of her filial piety, to bring her parents, the genesis of her own life, to a place where they could die as free people was a triumph that transcended mere survival. It was a restoration of dignity, a reclaiming of the right to care for one's own elders that slavery had systematically denied. These early missions were fueled by a specific, localized love. While she would eventually help many who were not her blood relations, the core of her motivation remained the reunification of her fractured family. Each trip back to the Eastern Shore was a defiance of the economic system that treated her loved ones as capital. By stealing them away, she was not just saving their lives, she was robbing the slaveholders of their property, striking a blow against the financial bedrock of the South. The rescues were intimate, terrifying, and deeply personal. They required her to walk past former masters who might recognize her, to hide in marshes she had navigated as a child, and to confront the ghosts of her past. Through these acts, Tubman demonstrated that the bonds of family were stronger than the chains of iron, and that the love of a sister and daughter could overcome the most formidable machinery of oppression history had ever devised. Chapter 10: A Life on the Run. Constant risk and vigilance. To live as a conductor on the Underground Railroad was to inhabit a world of perpetual twilight, where the distinction between safety and peril was as shifting as the shadows in a moonlit forest. For Harriet Tubman, life on the run was not a singular event, but a sustained state of existence. It required a hypervigilance that taxed the mind and body to their absolute limits. Every rustle of leaves could be a patrol, every baying of a hound could signal the end. The romanticized image of the Underground Railroad often obscures the visceral, grinding reality of the journey, the biting cold of winter nights, the gnawing hunger, the physical exhaustion of walking hundreds of miles, and the psychological burden of carrying not just one's own life, but the lives of terrified passengers in one's hands. Tubman's vigilance was born of necessity and honed by experience. She operated primarily in the winter months when the nights were longest, providing the maximum cover of darkness. This strategic choice, however, meant braving freezing temperatures, wading through icy rivers to throw bloodhounds off the scent, and sleeping on the frozen ground. She developed a keen sense of environmental awareness, reading the moss on trees, to determine north and utilizing the stars, specifically the North Star and the Big Dipper, as her immutable celestial compass. But her survival depended on more than just woodcraft. It required a mastery of disguise and misdirection. There are accounts of Tubman carrying chickens as a prop. If she spotted a white person approaching who might recognize her, she would release the chickens and chase after them, creating a scene of chaotic domesticity that deflected suspicion. No one, the logic went, would suspect a flustered woman chasing poultry of being a notorious fugitive known as Moses. The constant risk was compounded by her physical condition. As a teenager, Tubman had suffered a severe head injury when an overseer threw a heavy metal weight intended for another slave, striking her instead. This trauma resulted in temporal lobe epilepsy, causing her to fall into narcoleptic seizures or sleeping spells without warning. In the midst of a high-stakes escape, surrounded by slave catchers, she might suddenly lose consciousness. To her passengers, this must have been terrifying, their leader incapacitated, in the heart of enemy territory. Yet, Tubman interpreted these visions as divine premonitions, direct communications from God guiding her path. Upon waking, she would often have a renewed sense of direction or an urgent imperative to change course, instructions that invariably led to safety. This fusion of neurological vulnerability and spiritual conviction created an aura of invincibility around her, convincing her followers that she was indeed divinely protected. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had fundamentally altered the geography of freedom. The North was no longer a sanctuary. The arm of the law reached all the way to the Canadian border. This meant Tubman's journeys had to be longer, extending all the way to St. Catharines, Ontario. The logistical challenges of these extended treks were immense. She had to secure money for train tickets where possible, find safe houses stations where station masters would risk their own liberty to hide them, and procure food and shoes. She carried a pistol, not only for defense against slave catchers, but to enforce discipline among her charges. If a runaway, overcome by fear or exhaustion, threatened to turn back, Tubman would level her weapon and declare, "You go on or die." She understood that a defector could reveal the route, and the network, endangering everyone. It was a grim calculus, a testament to the ruthless pragmatism required to survive. Her vigilance extended to the psychological management of her passengers. She carried paregoric, an opium-based tincture, to quiet crying babies who might betray their position. She navigated the complex network of abolitionist sympathizers, learning whom to trust in a world rife with spies and bounty hunters with hefty rewards for her capture. Posters offering $40,000 for her capture, a figure likely aggregated from various rewards, underscore the threat she posed to the slave-owning establishment. She was a phantom, striking, disappearing, and reappearing, mocking the surveillance state of the South. Every successful journey eroded the myth of the contented slave and the omnipotence of the master. Her life on the run was a daily act of insurrection, a testament to the fact that the human desire for liberty creates a resilience that no system of surveillance or punishment can fully suppress. She walked the razor's edge of death for a decade, never losing a passenger, a statistic that speaks to a vigilance so total it bordered on the supernatural. Chapter 11. Abolitionist Alliances, working with anti-slavery leaders. While Harriet Tubman is rightly celebrated for her solitary courage in the swamps of Maryland, her effectiveness was significantly amplified by her integration into the broader abolitionist network. She was not an island. She was a vital node in a sophisticated web of resistance that spanned from the deep south to Canada and across the Atlantic to Great Britain. As her reputation as Moses grew, she came into contact with the intellectual and political titans of the anti-slavery movement. These alliances were symbiotic. Tubman provided the raw undeniable testimony of slavery's horrors and the operational success of rescues, while the abolitionists provided the funding, safe houses, and legal protection necessary to sustain her work. One of her most significant relationships was with William Still, the father of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. Still, a free black man, he served as a crucial station master and kept meticulous records of the fugitives who passed through his care. For Tubman, Still's office was often a command center where she could debrief, secure funds, and plan future incursions. Their relationship was one of mutual professional respect. Still, Tubman was recognized not just as a brave woman, but as a peerless strategist. His records provide some of the most detailed accounts of her trips, preserving the names and stories of those she saved. This partnership highlights the critical role of black organizational infrastructure in the fight for freedom. It was not merely white benevolence that fueled the Underground Railroad, but a highly organized black resistance network of which Tubman and Still were principal architects. Tubman's alliances extended to the white intelligentsia of the movement as well. She was a frequent guest in the homes of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, and, perhaps most notably, Thomas Garrett. Garrett, a Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware, was an indispensable ally. His home was often the last stop before the relative safety of Pennsylvania. Garrett provided shoes, food, and money to the destitute refugees Tubman brought to his door. He did this despite heavy fines and threats to his own livelihood. The bond between the illiterate fugitive and the wealthy Quaker merchant was forged in the fires of shared moral outrage. They represented the convergence of two distinct strands of American resistance: religious conviction and direct action working in concert to defy unjust laws. Furthermore, Tubman's relationship with John Brown, the militant abolitionist, reveals the more radical edge of her politics. While many abolitionists favored moral suasion and gradualism, Brown believed that slavery could only be purged through blood. He referred to Tubman as General Tubman, a title that acknowledged her military-like prowess. Tubman admired Brown's utter lack of racial prejudice and his willingness to sacrifice his life for the cause. She helped him recruit former slaves for his planned raid on Harper's Ferry, and provided him with topographical intelligence about the Virginia landscape. Illness prevented her from joining the raid itself, a twist of fate that likely saved her from the gallows. Her association with Brown underscores that Tubman was not a pacifist. She understood that the violence of slavery might necessitate a violent response, aligning her with the most aggressive faction of the abolitionist movement. She also moved in the circles of prominent suffragists and orators like Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, bridging the gap between the abolitionist and women's rights movements in these spaces. Tubman was a powerful symbol. Her presence at conventions and meetings grounded abstract political debates in the fleshy reality of human suffering. When she spoke, often falling into her characteristic deep sleep afterwards, she mesmerized audiences she did not speak with the polished rhetoric of the educated elite, but with the raw power of lived experience and parabolic wisdom. Her alliances were strategic tools she utilized to further her mission. She accepted money from wealthy patrons in New England, not for personal enrichment, but to fund her trips and support the community of runaways in Canada. These relationships demonstrate Tubman's political acumen. She navigated the complexities of race, class, and gender within the reform movements of the 19th century, leveraging every connection to forge a path to freedom for her people. Chapter 12, The Civil War Call, Spying and Nursing for the Union. When the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861, Harriet Tubman did not view it as a political dispute between states, but as the apocalyptic reckoning she had long predicted: the War of Liberation. While the Lincoln administration initially framed the conflict as a struggle to preserve the Union rather than to end slavery, Tubman understood the underlying truth. This was the death knell of the slave power. Unable to sit on the sidelines, she gravitated toward the action, believing that her unique skill set honed in the marshes of Maryland could be weaponized against the Confederacy. Her journey took her from the safety of the North to the Union-occupied coastal regions of South Carolina, specifically Port Royal and Hilton Head, where she would embark on a new phase of her extraordinary life. Initially, Tubman's role was humanitarian. The Union camps were flooded with contrabands, destitute escaped slaves who had fled to the Union lines. Disease was rampant, dysentery, smallpox, and typhoid fever decimated the ranks of soldiers and refugees alike. Tubman, drawing upon her deep knowledge of herbal medicine and root work learned from her ancestors, became a nurse of almost miraculous repute. She brewed remedies from water lilies and geraniums to treat dysentery, and cared for men with smallpox, without contracting the disease herself, a fact that further cemented the belief among the soldiers that she was blessed by God. Her nursing was not a gentle, passive vocation, it was gritty, dangerous work performed in the filth and chaos of field hospitals, providing comfort to men dying far from home. She worked tirelessly, often unpaid, supporting herself by baking pies and making root beer to sell to the soldiers in the evenings. However, the Union command soon realized that the Moses of her people possessed assets far more valuable than nursing skills. She held the trust of the local black population in a way that no white officer ever could. In the rigid racial hierarchy of the time, black people were often invisible to Confederate eyes, their presence ignored as they worked in fields and households. Tubman exploited this invisibility. She organized a ring of spies comprised of local boatmen, field hands, and house servants. These scouts ventured behind Confederate lines, mapping rivers, counting troops, and identifying the locations of torpedoes and mines in the waterways. Tubman acted as the handler for this intelligence network, collating the information and translating it into actionable military strategy for Union commanders, like General David Hunter and Colonel James Montgomery. This transition from nurse to spy master demonstrated her adaptability and strategic mind. She understood that information was the lifeblood of warfare. Her scouts could move through the swamps and marshes of the South Carolina low country with the same silent efficiency she had employed on the eastern shore. They brought back news of Confederate supply lines and vulnerable cotton stockpiles. Tubman's intelligence was reliable and precise, earning her the ability to draw government rations and travel on military transport privileges, rarely afforded to civilians, let alone black women. She essentially operated as an unconventional warfare specialist, bridging the gap between the formal military structure and the local population. The psychological impact of her presence cannot be overstated. To the formerly enslaved people in the Sea Islands, she was a living legend, proof that resistance was possible. To the Union officers, she was an enigma, small, illiterate black woman who commanded authority and possessed a tactical acumen that rivaled their own West Point training. Her service during the early years of the war was a constant struggle for recognition and resources, yet she persisted. She saw the war as a divine crusade, and her involvement was total, whether cooling the fevered brow of a dying soldier or plotting the coordinates of a rebel stronghold. Tubman was driven by the singular goal of crushing the institution of slavery. Her work in the shadows of the espionage world laid the groundwork for more overt military actions, proving that in the theater of war, the most effective weapon is often the one the enemy underestimates. Chapter 13, Freedom Fighters, Recruitment and Strategy. As the Civil War ground on, the necessity of enlisting black soldiers became increasingly apparent to the Union cause. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 fundamentally shifted the war's purpose, opening the door for African American men to officially bear arms. Harriet Tubman, situated in the liberated zone of Port Royal, South Carolina, found herself at the vanguard of this recruitment effort. She understood intuitively that freedom could not merely be given, it had to be seized and defended. The psychological transformation from chattel to soldier was profound, and Tubman became a principal agent in facilitating this shift. Her role expanded from gathering intelligence to actively encouraging the formerly enslaved men of the Sea Islands to don the Union blue and fight for their own liberation. Recruitment was not a simple task. The legacy of slavery had instilled a deep suspicion of white authority, and many freedmen were wary of trading the master's whip for the officer's command. Tubman, however, possessed the moral authority to bridge this divide. She spoke to the men not as a distant recruiter, but as Mother Moses, a figure of deliverance. She traveled through the camps and settlements, using her powerful oratory to frame military service as a divine duty and a path to manhood and citizenship. She articulated a strategy that linked their personal freedom to the destruction of the Confederacy. Her arguments were pragmatic and spiritual. If they wanted to ensure their children remained free, they had to kill the snake of slavery themselves. She worked closely with Colonel James Montgomery, a fervent abolitionist and veteran of the Bleeding Kansas conflicts, who commanded the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, a regiment of black soldiers. Montgomery respected Tubman deeply, relying on her to vet potential recruits and maintain morale. Tubman's strategic input went beyond mere recruitment speeches. She influenced the tactical deployment of these new troops. She possessed a nuanced understanding of the local terrain, the tidal creeks, the rice paddies, and the dense pine forests that the northern officers lacked. She advised on the type of warfare best suited for the region, guerrilla-style raids that struck at the economic heart of the Confederacy rather than massive pitched battles. She advocated for hitting the plantations, destroying supplies, and liberating the enslaved workforce, thereby crippling the South's ability to sustain its army. This strategy of exhaustion anticipated the total war tactics later employed by General Sherman. Tubman recognized that the plantation system was the logistical engine of the rebellion. Dismantling it was a military priority. Her involvement with the black dispatches, the intelligence gathered by African Americans, fed directly into this strategy. She debriefed refugees who crossed the lines, gathering granular details about which plantations held stores of cotton or food, and where Confederate sentries were posted. This information allowed the Union forces to launch targeted strikes. With a high probability of success, Tubman taught the recruits the importance of silence and stealth, skills she had mastered on the Underground Railroad. She helped instill a discipline that was organic to their environment, turning their familiarity with the landscape into a tactical advantage. The synergy between Tubman and the black regiments was potent. When the soldiers saw her a woman who had defied the slave catchers for a decade, fearless in the face of danger, it emboldened them. She marched with them, ate with them, and prayed with them. She was a living symbol of what they were fighting for. Her strategy was holistic. It combined psychological mobilization, intelligence gathering, and tactical planning. She did not just send men to fight, she prepared them to win. In doing so, she helped to refute the racist canard that black men would not fight. The regiments she helped recruit and advise proved their valor repeatedly, and Tubman's influence was the invisible spine stiffening their resolve. She was a general without a commission, a strategist without a rank, shaping the contours of the war in the South Carolina Low Country. Chapter 14, Camp and Battlefield. Tubman in the War. The theater of war in the South Carolina Sea Islands was a chaotic tapestry of humidity, insects, illness, and intermittent violence. For Harriet Tubman, the camp was not a place of rest, but a hub of ceaseless activity. Her existence there was a hybrid of domestic labor and military service, blurring the lines between the traditional roles of women and the hard realities of soldiering. She lived in a small tent or shack, often subsisting on the same meager rations as the troops, yet she managed to create a center of gravity for the community of contrabands and soldiers. Her camp life was characterized by an indefatigable industry. By day, she might be washing clothes or baking gingerbread to sell for self-support, and by night she was consulting with officers or preparing for an expedition. Tubman's presence on the battlefield, or more accurately, in the zones of active conflict, was extraordinary for a woman of her era. She did not remain safely in the rear. When Union gunboats ventured up the winding, treacherous rivers to raid plantations, Tubman was frequently on board. Her knowledge of the waterways, gleaned from her scouts, was often superior to the navigational charts possessed by the Navy. Captains, she stood on the decks, peering into the dense foliage, Pointing out hidden dangers and landing spots, the soldiers looked to her for reassurance. Her calm demeanor amidst the crack of rifle fire and the booming of cannons acted as a steadying force. She was a talisman of safety. The prevailing belief was that no harm could come to a vessel carrying Moses. Her role extended to the aftermath of battle as well. The carnage of Civil War combat was gruesome, with weaponry far outpacing medical capability. Tubman was often among the first to attend to the wounded as they were brought back from skirmishes. She moved among the maimed and dying, her small hands working to stanch bleeding, clean wounds, and offer spiritual comfort. She saw the true cost of the war in the shattered bodies of the black men she had helped recruit. Yet, she never flinched. Accounts describe her tending to soldiers with a tenderness that belied her tough exterior, singing hymns to soothe their agony. She battled the bureaucracy of the Army Medical Department to secure supplies for her boys, often using her own money to buy fruit and ice for the fever wards. Life in the camp also involved navigating the complex racial politics of the Union Army. While she had allies like Colonel Montgomery, she also faced skepticism and racism from other white officers and enlisted men, who resented a black woman having such autonomy. She had to constantly assert her authority and value. She carried a pass signed by General Hunter, which she guarded jealously, as it was her only official shield against those who would question her presence. Despite these indignities, she maintained a dignity that commanded respect. She was not a subordinate, she was a partner in the liberation effort. She mediated disputes among the freedmen, organized the distribution of clothing, and acted as a moral arbiter in the camp. The battlefield for Tubman was also spiritual. She held prayer meetings, turning the camp into a congregation. She understood that the war was a spiritual crisis as much as a political one. She preached a gospel of liberation theology, interpreting the war as God's judgment on a sinful nation. Her faith was the fuel that kept her going through the exhaustion and the horror. Whether she was dodging bullets on a riverboat or scrubbing blood-stained uniforms in a wash basin, Harriet Tubman was fully immersed in the machinery of war. She was a witness and a participant, her life in the camp serving as a microcosm of the larger struggle for freedom and dignity that defined the Civil War era. Chapter 15, Rescue Missions in Wartime, the Combahee River Raid. On the night of June 1st and the morning of June 2nd, 1863, Harriet Tubman etched her name into military history. With the Combahee River Raid, this operation was the apotheosis of her career as a liberator and strategist. It was not merely a rescue, it was a coordinated military assault, and significantly, it remains the only American military operation in the Civil War planned and executed by a woman. Collaborating with Colonel James Montgomery and the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, Tubman guided 3 gunboats to John Adams, the Sentinel, and the Harriet A. weed up the serpentine waters of the Combahee River, deep into the heart of Confederate territory. The raid was the culmination of weeks of intelligence gathering. Tubman's scouts had silently paddled the river, marking the locations of submerged torpedoes, mines that the Confederates had planted to sink Union vessels. On the night of the raid, Tubman stood at the helm of the lead ship, the John Adams. In the darkness, she directed the pilot, guiding the flotilla safely past the deadly explosives. Her presence was the key. Without her knowledge of the minefields, the mission would likely have ended in disaster before it began. As the ships bypassed the silent sentries, they approached the wealthy rice plantations that lined the riverbank's plantations, teeming with hundreds of enslaved people who had been alerted by Tubman's network that the Lincoln gunboats were coming. When the whistle of the steamships pierced the morning air, pandemonium and jubilation erupted. The scene Tubman later described was biblical in its chaotic glory. Hundreds of enslaved people, men, women, and children rushed toward the riverbanks. They carried children, chickens, pigs, and bundles of clothing, everything they owned. Confederate overseers and masters tried in vain to stop the exodus, but the presence of the armed black troops on the gunboats, combined with the sheer mass of the fleeing populace, overwhelmed them. Tubman famously recalled seeing a woman with a pot of rice still steaming on her head, terrified but running for freedom. as the small boats from the ships rowed ashore to pick up the refugees. The crowds were so thick they threatened to capsize the vessels. Tubman, standing on the deck, sang a popular anthem to calm the throng and organize the boarding process. The raid was also a destructive blow to the Confederate war effort. Troops under Montgomery's command disembarked to torch plantations, burning grand mansions, rice mills, and cotton storehouses. They confiscated thousands of dollars worth of supplies and livestock, effectively gutting the economic output of the Combahee region for the remainder of the war. The raid humiliated the Confederate leadership, proving that Union forces could strike with impunity deep within Southern territory, and that the enslaved population was a powder keg, waiting to explode. By the time the gunboats turned back toward Beaufort, over 750 enslaved people had been liberated. It was a massive, single-stroke emancipation. Most of the able-bodied men among the refugees immediately joined the Union Army, swelling the ranks of the black regiments. The Combahee River Raid was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare and psychological operations. It demonstrated Tubman's brilliance not just as a conductor of individuals but as a commander of masses. She had translated the tactics of the Underground Railroad stealth, intelligence, and decisive action to the scale of gunboat diplomacy. This event stands as the zenith of her wartime service, a moment where the fugitive became the conqueror, leading her people out of bondage under the cover of Union cannons. Chapter 16, Challenges After War, advocating for freedmen. The silence of the guns at Appomattox in 1865 signaled the end of the war, but for Harriet Tubman, it marked the beginning of a new, arguably more difficult struggle. The victory she had fought for emancipation was achieved, but the promise of freedom proved fragile and elusive. Tubman returned to her home in Auburn, New York, not to a hero's retirement, but to poverty and a nation eager to forget its debts to black patriots. The post-war years were defined by her relentless advocacy for the freedmen, the millions of newly liberated African Americans who were cast into a hostile society, with no property, no education, and no protection. One of the most immediate challenges Tubman faced was financial destitution. Despite her years of service as a spy, scout, and nurse, the federal government initially refused to pay her a pension. She had been paid irregularly during the war, often spending her own earnings to support the refugees. Now, she found herself responsible for a large, extended family and a constant stream of indigent people who showed up at her doorstep, seeking shelter. Her home in Auburn became a de facto benevolent society. She took in orphans, the elderly, and the disabled, feeding and clothing them through her own labor. She gardened, raised pigs, and sold produce door to door, a humbling reality for a woman who had once led military raids. Her fight for a government pension became a decades-long saga that highlighted the intersectional discrimination she faced. As a black woman, while white officers she served with received accolades and financial security, Tubman had to scrap for recognition. It wasn't until the late 1890s, after years of petitions from influential friends like Secretary of State William Seward and suffragists, that she was finally granted a meager monthly pension not for her own service as a spy, but as the widow of her second husband, Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran. This bureaucratic insult did not deter her. She continued to lobby for the rights of black veterans and the destitute. Tubman's post-war activism was deeply intertwined with the women's suffrage movement. She saw the right to vote as a critical tool for protecting the gains of emancipation. She toured the Northeast, speaking at conventions alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her speeches were electric. She used her war stories to argue that women who had risked their lives for the country deserved a voice in its governance. "I suffered enough to believe it," she would say regarding women's rights. However, she also navigated the racism within the suffrage movement, reminding white women that their liberation was incomplete without the inclusion of black women. Her final great project was the establishment of the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. She saw the elderly, formerly enslaved population, those who had given their strength to build the country and were now discarded as the most vulnerable. She dreamed of a sanctuary where they could spend their final years in dignity. Through relentless fundraising and the donation of her own property, she opened the home in 1908. It was the physical manifestation of her lifelong ethic of communal care. Harriet Tubman died in 1913, surrounded by the community she had built. Her post-war life was a testament to endurance. She advocated for freedmen not from a podium of power, but from the trenches of poverty. She fought the battles of Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era with the same ferocity she had fought the slave catchers. She understood that legal freedom was only the first step and that the work of building a just society required constant vigilance. Her legacy in these later years is one of radical hospitality and unyielding demand for the citizenship rights that had been paid for in blood. She remained until her last breath a soldier for her people. Chapter 17: Women's Rights and Activism, expanding her mission. The narrative of Harriet Tubman is frequently confined to the antebellum period, cementing her image as the fearless conductor of the Underground Railroad. However, to limit her history to the abolition of slavery is to ignore the seamless transition of her activism into the realm of gender equality. For Tubman, the fight for liberty was indivisible. The chains of racial bondage were intimately linked with the constraints placed upon women. As the Civil War concluded and the 13th Amendment was ratified, Tubman did not retire into a quiet existence. Instead, she redirected her formidable energy toward the nascent women's suffrage movement, understanding that true citizenship required the political empowerment of all people, regardless of race or sex. Her entry into the suffrage movement was a natural evolution of her life's work. Having secured physical freedom for herself and countless others, she recognized that legal and political freedom remained elusive without the ballot. Tubman became a fixture at suffrage conventions in the late 19th century, often appearing alongside prominent white suffragists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her presence on these stages was visually and rhetorically striking. While Anthony and Stanton offered intellectual arguments grounded in legal theory and philosophy, Tubman offered the undeniable authority of lived experience. She was a living testament to the strength, resilience, and capability of women, qualities that the patriarchal society of the time frequently denied. When Tubman spoke, she did so with the gravity of a veteran soldier. At the founding meeting of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, she was introduced as the oldest living warrior for the cause. Her speeches were often impromptu, filled with parables and direct references to her time in the swamps and battlefields. She famously argued for the vote by highlighting her own service, stating that she had suffered enough to earn the rights of citizenship. Her logic was piercingly simple yet irrefutable. If a woman could endure the lash, lead military expeditions, and risk her life for the Republic, she surely possessed the capacity to cast a vote. This intersectional approach, long before the term intersectionality was coined, forced the largely white, middle-class suffrage movement to confront the unique burdens and contributions of black women. However, Tubman's activism in this arena was not without its complexities. She navigated a movement that was often fractured by racism. While white suffragists utilized Tubman as a symbol of female strength, they frequently marginalized black women's specific political concerns in an effort to woo Southern support. Despite this, Tubman remained steadfast. She worked closely with African American organizations such as the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church to mobilize black women. She understood that for black women, the vote was not just a symbol of equality, but a necessary tool for survival. In an era of rising Jim Crow violence and economic disenfranchisement, her advocacy extended beyond the ballot box to the economic empowerment of women. Tubman championed the idea that women needed financial independence to be truly free. In her own life, she was a relentless entrepreneur, selling produce, raising pigs, and accepting donations to maintain her household and her philanthropic endeavors. She modeled a form of feminism that was deeply practical, rooted in the necessity of labor and community support. She often spoke to younger women about the importance of self-reliance, encouraging them to learn trades and support one another. One of the most poignant aspects of her later activism was her ability to bridge generations. She became a mentor to a younger generation of black activists, including Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell. To these women, Tubman was a living bridge to the heroic past and a guiding star for the future. She imparted not just the history of the struggle against slavery, but the strategic wisdom of how to organize, how to persist, and how to maintain faith in the face of overwhelming odds. Her involvement in the suffrage movement validated the struggle of black women, asserting their rightful place in the vanguard of American democracy. Ultimately, Chapter 1 illustrates that Harriet Tubman's mission was never static. It was a constantly expanding circle of concern. She viewed the oppression of women as a moral failing akin to slavery, and she attacked it with the same ferocity. Her activism challenges the historical tendency to separate the abolitionist and suffrage movements, showing instead how they were interwoven threads in the larger tapestry of American human rights. By examining her role in the women's rights movement, we gain a fuller understanding of her political philosophy, a belief in the absolute, God-given right of every human being to self-determination. Chapter 18, Later Life, Farming, Family, and Community. After the tumult of the Civil War and the adrenaline of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, a small city that would become the backdrop for the second half of her extraordinary life. It is here, in the quietude of upstate New York, that we see a different side of the Moses legend, not the nocturnal traveler navigating by the North Star, but the agrarian matriarch, the struggling provider, and the pillar of her local community. This chapter delves into the domestic realities of Tubman's later years, revealing a life characterized by relentless labor, profound familial devotion, and an unshakable commitment to communal welfare. In 1859, Tubman had purchased a 7-acre property in Auburn from then-Senator William H. Seward, a radical abolitionist and future Secretary of State. This transaction was illegal under the Fugitive Slave Act, yet it proceeded, marking a significant moment of defiance and stability. Following the war, this farm became her sanctuary and her base of operations. However, sanctuary implies rest, and Tubman's life in Auburn was anything but restful. She returned from the war with little money and was denied a government pension for decades. Consequently, the legendary liberator became a subsistence farmer. She tilled the soil, planted vegetables, raised pigs, and cultivated an orchard. The physical labor was grueling, exacerbated by the chronic pain from her old head injury and the weariness of age. Yet she approached farming with the same determination she had applied to her rescue missions. The Auburn property was never just a home for Harriet, it was a haven for her expansive family. She had spent years risking her life to extract her parents and siblings from the grip of slavery, and in freedom she felt a profound duty to support them. Her modest farmhouse was perpetually crowded. She cared for her aging parents, Ben and Rit, until their deaths, ensuring their final years were spent in dignity and peace. The house also sheltered siblings, nieces, nephews, and an ever-rotating cast of boarders. Tubman's definition of family was fluid and inclusive. She took in orphans and the destitute. Unable to turn away anyone in need, this generosity, while spiritually enriching, placed a tremendous economic strain on the household. Tubman was frequently in debt, forced to sell produce door-to-door or negotiate loans to keep the property afloat. In 1869, amidst this bustle of domestic life, Tubman married Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran and more than 20 years her junior. Their marriage was a partnership of mutual respect and shared struggle. Davis, like Tubman, suffered from health issues related to his service, and together they navigated the economic hardships of the Reconstruction era. They worked the farms side by side, selling butter and eggs to neighbors. Upon Davis's death in 1888, Tubman fought a protracted bureaucratic battle to receive a widow's pension, a struggle that highlighted the government's ingratitude toward black veterans and their families. Despite her financial precarity, Tubman became a central figure in the Auburn community. She was a familiar sight on the streets, a small, elderly woman often carrying a basket of goods, yet commanding immense respect. She was active in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which served as the spiritual and social hub for Auburn's black residents. Her faith remained the bedrock of her existence, influencing her interactions with neighbors and her approach to community service. She organized fairs and fundraisers, leveraging her fame to solicit donations from wealthy abolitionist friends in Boston and New York, not for her own enrichment, but to support the church and the poor. Tubman's later life also involved navigating the complex social dynamics of a segregated North. While Auburn was a center of abolitionism, it was not free from racial prejudice. Tubman had to advocate for herself and her community constantly. Yet, she also maintained friendships with the white elite of Auburn, most notably the Seward family. These relationships were strategic and genuine, providing a safety net when her resources ran dry. The tension between her celebrity status visitors often traveled to Auburn just to see her, and her daily struggle for survival is a defining theme of this period. She was a national icon who still had to haggle over the price of a pig. The culmination of her community work was a dream of establishing a home for the aged. She saw elderly formerly enslaved people living in squalor, without family or state support, and felt a divine calling to provide for them. This vision eventually led to the purchase of an additional 25 acres adjacent to her property. It was a massive undertaking for a woman of her age and means, yet she pursued it with singular focus. This endeavor, discussed more fully in later chapters, began in these years of farming and family building. Chapter 2 presents Harriet Tubman not as a statue, but as a woman of flesh and blood, rooted in the earth. It portrays the dignity of her labor and the depth of her love for her kin. Her life in Auburn demonstrates that freedom was not a destination, but a continuous process of building, sustaining, and caring for a community. In the mundane acts of farming and caretaking, Tubman exhibited a heroism just as profound as her nocturnal journeys, proving that the work of liberation continues long after the chains are broken. Chapter 19, Recognition and Respect, honoring her achievements. The trajectory of Harriet Tubman's public recognition is a study in delayed justice and the complexities of historical memory. While she was celebrated within abolitionist circles during her lifetime, broader societal acknowledgement of her contributions was often sporadic, insufficient, or hard-won. Chapter 3 examines the struggle for recognition that Tubman faced, both from the United States government and the public at large, and traces the evolution of her status from a marginalized figure to an American icon. This chapter is not merely a list of awards. It is an analysis of how society values or fails to value the labor of black women. One of the most glaring failures of recognition concerns Tubman's service during the Civil War. 4 years, she served the Union Army as a nurse, a cook, a scout, and a spy. She was the first woman to lead an armed assault during the Civil War in the Combahee River Raid, which liberated over 700 enslaved people. Despite this, her post-war battle for a government pension was agonizingly slow and humiliating. While white officers who served in similar capacities were readily compensated and honored, Tubman was forced to petition repeatedly, submit affidavits, and rely on the patronage of influential friends like Secretary of State William Seward to plead her case. It wasn't until the late 1890s, more than 30 years after the war ended, that she received a pension, and even then, it was initially granted to her as the widow of Nelson Davis, not for her own independent service. Later, a meager sum was added for her work as a nurse, but it never approached the compensation given to male soldiers. This bureaucratic erasure serves as a potent symbol of the systemic racism and sexism that Tubman fought against, even as she sought recognition from the very government she had helped to preserve. Despite the government's reticence, Tubman did receive significant recognition from her peers and the activist community. In 1869, Sarah Bradford published Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, a biography intended to raise funds for Tubman. While the book contained inaccuracies and mythologized aspects of her life, it was crucial in cementing her reputation and providing her with much-needed income. It introduced her story to a wider audience, framing her as an American Joan of Arc. Tubman herself understood the power of her narrative and participated in its dissemination, realizing that her fame was a tool she could leverage for her charitable work. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Tubman became a revered figure among the African American intelligentsia and the growing women's club movement. She was honored at receptions in Boston and New York, where she was often the guest of honor. At these events, she was treated with the reverence due a living ancestor. The National Federation of Afro-American Women, later the NACW, hailed her as a pioneer. In these spaces, she was not a curiosity but a hero. The respect she commanded in these circles was absolute. When she entered a room, the audience would rise. This grassroots recognition stands in stark contrast to the official indifference of the state. Local recognition in Auburn also evolved. While she was initially seen as a poor, eccentric neighbor by some, the community eventually came to understand the magnitude of the legend living in their midst. The local press began to cover her birthday celebrations and church activities with increasing respect. Upon her death in 1913, she was granted a funeral with military honors, a rare tribute for a woman and an African American at that time. The service was attended by local dignitaries, signaling a shift in how the white establishment viewed her legacy. A plaque was erected at the county courthouse in 1914, a tangible, if belated, sign of civic pride. However, true national recognition arrived slowly in the decades following her death. During the mid-20th century, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Tubman was rediscovered by a new generation of activists who saw her militant resistance as a precursor to their own struggles. She moved from being a figure of folklore to a subject of serious historical inquiry. Schools began to be named after her, and her story became a staple of Black History Month curricula. The ultimate measure of respect, however, involves correcting the historical record. This chapter explores modern efforts to honor her, such as the authorization of the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park, and the ongoing, albeit stalled, efforts to place her portrait on the $20 bill. These contemporary gestures are attempts to rectify the financial and symbolic injustices she faced in life. The debate surrounding the currency change highlights that Tubman remains a potent and sometimes controversial symbol of American history. In recognition and respect, we see that honoring Tubman is not a passive act of remembering, but an active engagement with the values she stood for. The delay in her recognition reflects the nation's struggle to grapple with the legacy of slavery and the agency of Black women. By chronicling the honors she received and those she was denied, we gain insight into the changing tides of American prejudice and the enduring power of a life lived for others. Chapter 20, Legacy of Bravery, Harriet Tubman's Enduring Impact. Harriet Tubman died in 1913, but the resonance of her life has only amplified in the century since her passing. Chapter 4, Legacy of Bravery, moves beyond the biographical details of her life to assess the long shadow she casts over American culture, politics, and social justice movements. Tubman's legacy is not merely historical, it is functional and inspirational, providing a blueprint for resistance and humanitarianism that remains critically relevant. In the modern era, at the core of Tubman's enduring impact is the redefinition of American heroism. Traditionally, the American hero was white, male, and often a conqueror. Tubman subverted this archetype entirely. She was Black, female, enslaved, and a liberator. Her legacy forces a reckoning with the definition of patriotism. Was true patriotism obedience to the laws of the land, as the Fugitive Slave Act demanded? Or was it adherence to a higher moral law, as Tubman demonstrated? By defying unjust laws to uphold the principles of liberty, Tubman established a legacy of civil disobedience that would influence future leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. She proved that the highest form of citizenship is sometimes found in resistance to the state. Her impact is vividly seen in the ongoing struggle for racial justice, Tubman is the ancestral mother of black resistance movements, the Black Power movement of the 1960s and the Black Lives Matter movement of the 21st century. Both draw upon her imagery and ethos. She represents the refusal to accept subjugation and the willingness to take radical action to secure freedom. Her famous dictum that she could have freed more slaves if only they knew they were slaves serves as a perennial call to consciousness, urging oppressed peoples to recognize their condition and fight for their liberation. Her legacy teaches that freedom is not granted, it is seized. Furthermore, Tubman's legacy extends into the realm of feminism and intersectionality. As discussed in previous chapters, she was a suffragist, but her modern legacy elevates her to a feminist icon who embodies the specific struggles of black women. She navigated the double burden of racism and sexism with a strength that continues to inspire. Contemporary feminist scholars and activists look to Tubman as a model of leadership that is communal rather than hierarchical. She did not lead from a throne but from the front lines, sharing the risks and burdens of those she led. This model of servant leadership is a cornerstone of her enduring influence. The landscape of American geography and public memory has also been transformed by her legacy. The preservation of the landscapes she traversed, the marshes of the eastern shore of Maryland, the safe houses in Delaware and Pennsylvania, and her home in Auburn creates a physical map of resistance across the Northeast. These sites serve as pilgrimage grounds, where people can connect with the visceral reality of her journey. The establishment of national parks and monuments dedicated to her is a victory against the erasure of black history. It ensures that the narrative of the American landscape includes the stories of those who fled across it, not just those who owned it. Culturally, Tubman has become a muse for artists, writers, and filmmakers. From sculpture to cinema, her image is constantly reinterpreted. This chapter analyzes how these cultural productions shape our understanding of her. Whether depicted as a gun-toting warrior or a spiritual mystic, these representations keep her memory alive and dynamic. They allow each generation to find new meaning in her story. However, this commodification of her image also carries risks, and the chapter critically examines the line between honoring her legacy and reducing her to a two-dimensional symbol. Finally, Tubman's legacy is found in the humanitarian spirit she embodied. Her work with the elderly and the poor set a precedent for social work and community care. Organizations that bear her name today, shelters, clinics, and advocacy groups continue her work of caring for the marginalized. Her legacy asserts that a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members. In conclusion, Chapter 4 argues that Harriet Tubman's impact is enduring because it is universal, yet specifically grounded in the American experience. She represents the best of the American spirit, the drive for freedom against all odds, while simultaneously critiquing the nation's worst sins. She is a mirror in which the United States sees both its darkness and its light. Her bravery was not just in facing slave catchers, but in imagining a world where such bravery would no longer be necessary. That imagined world is a true legacy, a vision toward which we are still striving.